Why did General Motors keep Buick? When they had to shed other brands, why did they keep the Buick nameplate? Well, there's a very common answer to that, and I don't buy it. And why didn't they keep a different brand? Well, I've got some thoughts on it. Welcome back to All Cars Y'all. I am John, and this issue comes up rather frequently on this channel, as a matter of fact. Whether I talk about Buick, I do a history of Oldsmobile, or I do a reaction video that includes a Pontiac, I always get questions about why did they keep Buick, why didn't they keep Oldsmobile or Pontiac, for example. And today, I want to talk about it with y'all, because I've got some thoughts on it, and it runs counter to the traditional answer. Now, that traditional answer is they kept Buick because they had so many sales in China. And it's actually really fascinating that the Buicks we see here are considered much more premium vehicles, much more in line with, say, Mercedes in the Chinese market. But I don't buy this at all. So let's roll back the clock just a little bit. And during the 80s and the 90s and in 2000s, GM had an explosion of brands. They added Geo to it, they added Hummer, they added Saturn. And as the bankruptcy approached, sales were kind of struggling. It finally all caught up with them. And GM had to shed brands during their bankruptcy. They got rid of Hummer, they got rid of Saturn, and they ended up getting rid of Pontiac and Oldsmobile. Now, don't nitpick me over the timeline of some of this. The end result is after the bankruptcy, those brands were gone. And people still questioned, why did they keep Buick? Buick's an old person brand. And the answer is usually given as some variation of because they have such strong Chinese sales. And I'm pretty sure I've said that on this channel too. I don't really know, but it's easy. It's the easy answer without getting into some nuance around the whole thing. But I don't really buy it. And the reason is a brand is really nothing more than a name and a logo. And a car from one brand can become a different brand just by changing a few things. Buick itself is not a separate entity. It doesn't have its own unique chassis, engine, transmission choices. It's got some unique styling, maybe the interior, and it's got its own logo and name. But think about the last Regal. Well, that was an Opel. It was built in Germany. It just had Buick nameplates on it. The new Buick SUV is a Chevy Trax with Buick nameplates on it. And that's actually built by GM Korea, which used to be Daewoo. And it's not just built by them, it's designed and engineered by them. So it's a South Korean car built in South Korea. Just two different nameplates come here as a Chevy and a Buick. So the necessity for Buick to exist in America does not exist for them to continue to have Chinese sales. Buick could cease to exist and they would still have their Chinese market because they've got the platforms, they've got the manufacturing. They just keep producing them with different names and badges on them. So I actually reject that argument outright. Now, let's look at Buick versus Oldsmobile. Why didn't they keep Oldsmobile? Well, brands can shift position in the marketplace. Certainly there was a time when Pontiacs were a little boring and John DeLorean came in and made it the excitement division. You can move up and down and sideways with your branding, with new engineering, with new advertising. So Oldsmobile was kind of the semi-premium like Buick, maybe a little more sporty. So I certainly think that Oldsmobile could have taken that premium position that Buick occupies. And I say that as if you've got Chevy and you've got Cadillac up here comparing with the BMWs and the Mercedes, there's a middle layer right here of those premium level but not really luxury players like Acura or Infiniti and things like that. And that's kind of where Buick plays right now. Oldsmobile could have certainly moved up there. And I would argue they had the best styling of all of them, but their sales didn't really show it. And I think Oldsmobile was doomed from the beginning simply because they were Oldsmobile. In a world where we value youth, having a car brand name Old wasn't ever going to cut it. So I think you combine sales It's an American-only brand, and the name, I think Oldsmobile was doomed from the very, very get-go. But that does leave Pontiac. And I've had a lot of comments about Pontiac, and I'm surprised that Pontiac was one of my least favorite, if not my least favorite, of all the GM brands. But it has a passionate following from people even today who constantly bring it up in comments on my videos. And I had a couple that really impacted me and got me thinking about it. The first is that during the bankruptcy, Pontiac sales were still kind of healthy. They were selling, I think, something like 240,000 a year, something like that. So they were still selling relatively well. Number two, they'd been trying to do some interesting things and inject some life into it. Now, the Aztec at least showed there was life there and they were doing something, but they had the Solstice, they had the GTO, they had some other things, but none of them really sold that well. It was a struggle to find traction with Pontiac. And the last thing is that somebody brought up that imagine a world where they kept Pontiac and turned it into truly the performance division to compete with, say, Dodge, where you end up with these really, really powerful cars, but for, less expensive than what you're going to get with Cadillac. That's a pretty awesome picture, but hindsight is 2020. So why did they get rid of Pontiac and not Buick? Well, I think it's because during the 90s and the 2000s, we knew everybody was moving towards SUVs. And they had to keep GMC, and Buick gave itself very easily to SUVs. Pontiac as a performance division would require more cars. So the simple question is, where would the platforms come from? Now, GM ended up getting rid of Opel. They ended up, withdrawing from Australia. The car platforms were drying up. Now, Cadillac has platforms, but could you take a Cadillac platform and cheapen it down, take enough cost out of it, and add performance to be less expensive but not step on Cadillac's toes? I think that's part of the calculus that went into getting rid of Pontiac, is they didn't see a future for the lineup without massive investment basically into just one division. And that leads us back to Buick. It makes sense. Buick does not feel, to me, necessarily old any more than Acura or Lexus feels old. They've gone through a long period of questionable styling, questionable materials, some questionable products. But I think they've kind of found their footing. I think some of their stuff is pretty good looking. Some of the interiors are very good looking in pictures. Although personal experience, they aren't that impressive in person. But they've successfully started moving their demographics younger, moving their demographics more female. That leaves people like me behind, where there's no traditional Buick for me. I mean, if I want a largish, mid-size, sedate, quiet, soft-riding sedan, where do I go to? Buick has only SUVs. But I think it's justified by Oldsmobile and Pontiac being largely only American brands. While I don't buy that argument that Buick was kept because of Chinese sales, I think it does allow flexibility if you put yourself in the situation of GM executives sitting down saying, which brands are we going to cut? We've got to keep that mid-size, that mid-premium level, and we sell a ton of Buicks. That can provide backwards into America. And that's what's really happened, is that Buick has become more of a Chinese brand selling over here in America than vice versa. You may not agree. You may think Oldsmobile was better. You may think Pontiac was better. You may think that Pontiac could have really become something, but I think they would have struggled in the SUV world. Very similar to, in some ways, what Dodge is going through right now, and Alfa Romeo, as a matter of fact. Of having a car be sporty in a world where you need SUVs to sell in volume, now you're trying to build sporty SUVs. That's a lot more difficult than I think people think, and that's not really the meat of the market where the sales are. It'll be interesting to see what Dodge does in the future and how successful they are, as I believe they start expanding their SUV offerings. But it explains to me why they didn't keep Pontiac. Oldsmobile, I don't think it was ever really a serious consideration. And that leaves Buick. I think GM's doing an okay job with them right now. But basically, that argument that they kept it because of the Chinese sales, I don't buy that. Not exactly. Let me know what you think below, guys. Appreciate you being here.